All right, so you ready to dive into another one of these deep dives?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. You've brought us a story that seems like it never really leaves the headlines, even after all these years, right? TWA Flight 800.
Yeah.
And you brought a ton of material on this one. So I get the feeling you're not just looking for the kind of the surface level on this one.
Right.
And you're in the right place. Today we're going deep. We're talking about a tragic puzzle, the quest for answers, and what this event really taught us about aviation, about ourselves, and I think about how we face the unknown, something we all have to grapple with. So what is it about this particular tragedy, even decades later, that you think still captivates people?
Well, I think that it wasn't just one singular event. There's so many threads to this story.
Yeah.
You know, the human element of it, obviously the investigations, the lingering what-ifs. I think that's what captivates me anyway.
Yeah. It's like we're hardwired for that sense of closure, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And when we don't get it, the questions linger even longer.
Yep.
Okay, so let's do this. Before we get too far into the weeds here, let's set the scene. It's July 17th, 1996. Picture this. TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747, takes off from JFK, lights cutting through the summer night sky. It's bound for Paris, full of families, tourists, students. I mean, you can picture the excitement, right?
Oh, yeah.
Summer adventures. Just 12 minutes into the flight, it's gone.
Just like that.
The plane vanishes from radar, crashes into the Atlantic Ocean, 230 lives lost.
Yeah. And I think that's where the human cost becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because among those passengers were 16 students and 5 chaperones from a small town in Pennsylvania. Montoursville, exactly. They were part of their high school's French club and heading to France on a trip that they had worked so hard to afford. So, you know, imagine the families, imagine the entire town grappling with that kind of loss, you know.
Yeah.
It shook the nation, I think, not just because of the scale of the tragedy, but because it felt so personal, you know.
It's like, you know when you hear about a plane crash and it's always heartbreaking, but this one, it's different.
It's magnified times 1,000 because you know there are faces and there are stories and there are futures behind those numbers.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, of course, the investigation begins. But given the timing, the political climate back then, I mean, the speculation must have been just off the charts, right?
It was a different time. This is the 1990s. The threat of terrorism, I think, felt very real. You know, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie was still fresh in everyone's minds.
Right. Yeah.
So when witnesses started coming forward and they were describing a streak of light just before the TWA 800 explosion,
oh, wow.
Well, you can understand why people immediately jumped to kind of like the worst case scenario.
It's like that scene in every disaster movie ever, right?
Right.
The what if very quickly spirals into, oh no, and then all of a sudden everyone's on edge.
Exactly.
So did they actually investigate a potential missile attack?
They had to.
Yeah.
You can't ignore evidence, even if it seems far-fetched at first.
So you've got these 2 massive investigations that are running in parallel.
Oh, wow.
So you have the NTSB, that's the National Transportation Safety Board. They're laser focused on the mechanics of the crash itself. What went wrong? Was it a mechanical failure? Was it a design flaw in the plane? And at the same time, you have the FBI, and they're looking into this possibility of a criminal act.
Right.
Was it a bomb? Was it a missile? And it was just a pressure cooker for everyone involved. 2
teams, 2 different sets of expertise, but all under the weight of, unimaginable public scrutiny, and then that heartbreaking knowledge that 230 lives are depending on their findings.
Yeah.
Talk about a high-stakes investigation.
And it wasn't just the pressure. You know, it was the sheer scale of this investigation.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine this. They had to recover pieces of this plane from the ocean floor.
Oh, wow.
We're talking thousands of feet below the surface,
Yeah.
a massive debris field, strong currents, and then the task of piecing those fragments back together like some kind of tragic jigsaw puzzle.
It's like trying to solve a crime scene.
Yeah.
But instead of a room, it's spread out over miles of ocean.
Exactly.
So where do you even begin? I mean, you've got these witness accounts, some of them at least, pointing towards a missile. You've got the possibility of a bomb, mechanical failures. I mean, how do you even wrap your head around all of those different angles?
I think it's a real testament to the dedication of both the NTSB and the FBI.
Right.
That they tackled each one of these theories with just rigor.
Yeah.
Take the missile theory, for instance. Remember those witness accounts, the streak of light?
Right, right.
They went back and meticulously analyzed radar data. They were trying to corroborate those visual reports.
Right.
They scoured satellite imagery, interviewed military personnel. I mean, they really left no stone unturned.
And what about, did any of it pan out?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
Yeah.
Despite all that initial buzz, the evidence just didn't support a missile.
Okay.
Radar data showed some blips, sure, but nothing conclusive.
Right.
And certainly nothing that screamed missile strike. And remember, this is the 90s, not exactly known for crystal clear satellite images like we have today.
Right.
So it was a lot harder back then.
So it sounds like the investigation, at least on that front, kind of hit a dead end.
In a way, yeah.
But what about
There's other avenues.
the other big theory that was making headlines back then? The bomb.
The possibility of a bomb, yeah.
I remember that being huge in the news cycle.
And rightfully so. Because the specter of another Lockerbie was looming large over everything.
Oh, yeah.
And this time, the FBI had a crucial advantage, evidence. They actually discovered traces of explosives on some of the recovered wreckage.
Oh, hold on. They found explosives.
Traces.
On the plane. That changes the whole...
It's a major development, for sure.
That's a game changer.
No doubt. But here's where things take a turn. Remember how we talked about that pressure cooker atmosphere of this investigation?
Right.
Well, that pressure pushed the FBI to uncover a detail that completely shifted their understanding of those explosives.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for me, right? They find traces of explosives, which you think, okay, we're done here. That's it. Case closed.
Smoking gun, right.
But then there's a twist.
Yeah, so they're looking at every single detail of this plane's history.
Right.
And it turns out that just a few weeks before the crash, the same aircraft, TWA 800, same tail number, had been used in a training exercise for explosive detecting dogs.
Wait, hold on. So they used a passenger plane to train bomb-sniffing dogs.
Yes.
And then just put it back in service like nothing happened. That seems, I don't know.
Just a little casual.
A little casual given the circumstances.
Looking back, yeah, it does. But at the time, it wasn't completely unheard of.
Okay.
And the type of explosives they found on the wreckage matched what was used in the training. And then on top of that, the damage pattern on the plane just didn't line up with what you'd expect from a bomb. No signs of a detonation point, no outward blast pattern. It was a crucial clue, and it really shifted the investigation in a whole new direction.
So no missile, no bomb. Did they ever explore the possibility of, just a structural issue with the plane itself?
Absolutely, yeah.
Something that could have caused it to just break apart in midair.
That was a major focus for the NTSB.
Right.
And remember that massive recovery operation we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, all those pieces they pulled from the ocean, they weren't just examined, they were painstakingly reassembled.
Wow.
Almost like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, but on a much larger and obviously more tragic scale.
Yeah. And it took 4 years to do all of this.
4 years.
That's longer than some people spend in college.
Yeah, that's how massive this investigation was.
Wow. So, but in the end, they were able to rule out a structural failure.
They were.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for lack of looking. I mean, they went over every inch of that reconstructed plane, examining the metal fatigue, corrosion, any microscopic crack that could have spelled disaster.
Right.
But what they found was a testament to the plane's original construction. There was no pre-existing damage. There was no inherent weakness that could explain the sudden and catastrophic explosion.
Okay, so if it wasn't a missile, a bomb, or the plane just falling apart, what was the NTSB's final verdict? What did they say brought down TWA Flight 800?
Well, after years of this relentless investigation, the NTSB came to the conclusion that the probable cause of the crash was an explosion in the center wing fuel tank.
The fuel tank?
The fuel tank.
But how does a fuel tank just explode like that, especially on a modern airline? You'd think those things would be built like, tanks, right?
You would think so, but here's the thing. A plane's fuel tanks aren't always filled with just liquid fuel.
Right.
You have this dangerous mix of fuel vapor and air, especially during flight. Think about those caution flammable signs you see at gas stations. Same principle. Much bigger consequences, obviously.
Right. Okay. So you're saying this fuel-air mixture, it becomes highly flammable. So what sets it off?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, in the case of TWA 800, it's a question without a definitive answer.
Really?
The NTSB, they investigated everything. Faulty wiring, mechanical sparks, even something like static electricity. They looked at it. They built mock-ups, ran countless simulations. But in the end, that exact trigger, that initial spark, it remained elusive.
So even after 4 years and all of that effort, it's still a bit of a mystery.
To an extent, yeah. But they did uncover some critical contributing factors. Remember those air conditioning packs we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, they generate a significant amount of heat. And over time, that heat could essentially bake the fuel tank.
Oh, wow.
Creating that volatile environment, ripe for an explosion.
So like leaving a gas can out in the sun too long, not a good look.
Yeah, exactly. And back then, in 1996, there weren't any regulations requiring systems to cool those fuel tanks or to make that vapor less flammable.
Yeah.
That changed after TWA 800.
So even though this tragedy remains shrouded in some mystery, it did have a lasting impact on aviation safety.
It did. The NTSB's investigation, even with its lingering unknowns, it led to really critical changes. New planes, they were required to have systems that reduce the risk of fuel tank explosions.
Okay.
So imagine taking that explosive oxygen in the fuel tank and replacing it with something harmless like nitrogen gas. That's essentially what these systems do.
To starve the fire before it can even start.
Exactly.
Smart. So where do things stand now? What's the takeaway for our listener, the person who's been, digging into all those articles, looking for those answers in the case of TWA 800?
It's a story that stays with you, not just because of the scale of the tragedy, but because it reminds us that even with our best efforts, there are some things we may never fully know. The streak of light that witnesses described, the exact trigger of that explosion, these remain open questions.
It's like you said at the beginning, it's a story with so many threads.
It is.
And I think it's easy to get lost in those threads, but one thing's for sure. The legacy of TWA 800, it lives on, not just in those unanswered questions, but in those tangible ways. It changed how we approach aviation safety and how we support families who've experienced such unimaginable loss.
Yeah.
Because of the investigation, the future's a little bit safer, a little more prepared, even if it can't erase the past.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
It has. Always a pleasure to explore these ideas.
And to our listeners, we hope this has sparked your own curiosity and perhaps inspired you to chart your own unique course through the vast landscape of knowledge.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to make sure you hear our latest paranormal investigation, air disaster investigations, and ghostly tales.